Well, howdy, partner. Name's Eureka Earl, and I thank you kindly for stopping by Guns and Nuggets. Round these parts, we spin tales where gold was struck, guns were drawn, and legends made. If this here story tickles your fancy, don't be shy. Tip your hat with a like, hitch your wagon with a subscribe, and tell your trail mates. Plenty more tales are waiting.
Howdy, partner. Name's Earl, and I appreciate you settling in by the fire tonight. These old bones don't move like they used to, but the stories, well, they still flow easy as whiskey down a parched throat. And speaking of whiskey, that's what tonight's tale is all about. Whiskey, gold, and the kind of reckoning that echoes through canyons long after the last man stopped breathing. Now, you ever been to a place that feels wrong? Not haunted exactly, but like the land itself remembers something it wishes it could forget? That's Whiskey Creek for you. Sits about 40 miles northwest of what used to be a proper mining town, though calling it a town now would be generous as a saint. These days it's just broken timber, rusted iron, and shadows that move when they shouldn't. The creek itself dried up back in '89, or maybe it was '90. Time gets fuzzy when you're talking about ghost towns and old sins. But here's the peculiar thing. Partner, that creek bed still hums. Not like water running over stones, but like wind passing through the hollow of a whiskey bottle. Some nights, if you're fool enough to camp nearby, you can hear it singing a tune that ain't quite music and ain't quite silence. Just this low, mournful sound that gets under your skin and stays there. I've been out to Whiskey Creek 3 times in my life. First time was back in '52, when I was young and stupid and thought I knew everything worth knowing. Went out there on a dare, slept in what was left of the old saloon, and woke up with frost in my beard even though it was August. Swore I heard voices all night, men arguing, bottles breaking, boots scraping across wooden floors that weren't there anymore. Second time was 10 years later. Took a woman I was sweet on, thinking the abandoned town would be romantic under the stars. She lasted maybe an hour before she was begging to leave. Said the place made her feel like she was being watched by dead men with unfinished business. We rode out that night and she never spoke to me again. Can't say I blame her. Third time was just 5 years back. Went alone, with a good horse, a better rifle, and a mind to finally understand what it was about that place that crawled into your dreams and wouldn't leave. Spent 2 days poking through the ruins, reading names carved into rotting wood, finding rusted tins of tobacco and belt buckles, half buried in the dust. And I found something else too, something that made me understand why that creek hums the way it does. But I'm getting ahead of myself, like an old fool tends to do when the fire's warm and the night's listening. Whiskey Creek wasn't always a ghost town. Back in the 1,870 seconds, it was alive as any place in the territories, maybe more alive, considering how much dying went on there. See, they found gold in the canyon walls, real gold, the kind that makes men forget they got souls worth keeping. Prospectors flooded in like ants to spilled honey, each one convinced he'd be the one to strike it rich and ride out a king. The town grew up fast the way boom towns do a saloon first, naturally, because men need whiskey before they need shelter. Then a general store, a blacksmith, a crooked assayer who'd cheat you blind if you didn't watch him close. They built it all right on the banks of that creek, which ran clear and cold back then, full of mountain snowmelt that tasted like freedom and possibility. They called it Whiskey Creek because of the saloon, which was run by a woman named Sadie who'd come west after her husband died of cholera back in Missouri. She kept the best whiskey for 200 miles, imported from Kentucky in barrels that still smelled like charred oak and old promises. Men would ride 3 days just to taste her whiskey and maybe catch a smile from Sadie, who was pretty in the way dangerous things sometimes are. But the real draw was the gold. Oh, partner, the gold. It ran through those canyon walls like veins in a man's arm, thick and rich, and waiting to be bled. Some claims paid out modest, others made men wealthy enough to retire and never work another day, and a few, a very few, struck veins so pure and plentiful that it drove them mad with the weight of their fortune. That's where our story really begins, with 4 men who found more gold than any group of partners ought to find, more gold than they knew what to do with, more gold than their friendship could bear. The winter that changed everything came in fierce and early October, and already there was snow piling up in the passes, cutting Whiskey Creek off from the rest of the world until spring. The miners who'd struck rich started getting nervous, hoarding their gold, sleeping with pistols under their pillows. Trust started dying faster than the weeds when the first frost hit. I heard the story from different folks over the years, from an old prospector who'd been there but left before the worst of it, from a woman whose father had been the undertaker, from drifters who'd passed through and heard the whispers. Each telling was a little different, but the bones of it stayed the same. 4 men, 1 claim, 1 barrel of whiskey, and a reckoning that turned the creek red before it went dry forever. The wind's picking up now. You hear that? See how it moves through these canyon rocks, making that low humming sound? That's what Whiskey Creek sounds like, only deeper, older, like it's been carrying the same tune for 50 years and can't remember how to stop. They say if you go out there on certain nights when the moon's just a sliver and the stars look cold enough to shatter, you can see 4 figures standing around an old whiskey barrel. They don't move much, just stand there passing a cup between them, and if you get close enough, you might hear them talking. But you won't want to get close enough, partner, because what they're saying ain't meant for living ears. The last man who tried to claim that land, some young fool from California with more ambition than sense. He lasted 2 weeks before he rode out pale as a corpse and swearing he'd never touch gold or whiskey again as long as he lived. Said he woke up every night to the sound of boots walking around his tent, walking and walking in circles like something was pacing, working up courage for violence that never quite came. That's the thing about Whiskey Creek. The violence already happened. It's done, finished, over with. But the echo of it that's still there, still playing out night after night like some kind of terrible theater that nobody bought tickets for but everybody's got to watch. Now I know what you're thinking. Old Earl's been nipping at his own supply, spinning yarns to pass the time and keep warm, and maybe there's some truth to that. But I've got proof, partner. Got it right here in my saddlebag, a journal I found in the ruins, leather cover so cracked and dry it near about crumbled when I touched it. Belonged to one of those 4 men, written in his own hand, dated from that winter when everything went to hell. I'll tell you what it says as we go. Tell you about Jed and Colton and Briggs and Tate. Tell you about the gold they found and the poison that found them. Tell you about the night the bottle broke and the morning that came after, when Whiskey Creek earned its name in ways old Sadie never intended. But first, let me pour us both some coffee. Strong and black, none of that sweet stuff that hides the taste. Because this story's bitter all the way through, partner. Bitter as betrayal and twice as hard to swallow. The fire's burning good now, and the stars are coming out clean and bright. Perfect night for a story about men who reached for gold and grabbed hold of something darker. Perfect night to talk about Whiskey Creek and the reckoning that still haunts that dry canyon. So settle in, partner. This one's gonna take a while. The year was 1873 when 4 men rode into what would become Whiskey Creek with nothing but hope, determination, and the kind of hunger that makes men do things they wouldn't normally consider. They weren't friends exactly, not yet, but they weren't enemies either. Just 4 souls who'd answered the same whisper that gold was waiting in these canyons for anyone bold enough to claim it. Jed Harker was the oldest of the 4, maybe 35, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that never quite settled on anything. He'd prospected all over the territories, California, Nevada, up in Montana, and he'd made money and lost it more times than he could count. But he had the nose for it, that instinct that told him where to dig and when to walk away. Most men respected Jed. Some feared him. None doubted he knew his business. Colton Webb was younger, maybe 28, with dark hair and a smile that could charm rattlesnakes into dancing. He'd been a gambler before turning to gold, and he brought that mentality with him, always calculating odds, always looking for the angle that paid better than honest work. But he was strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, and when he put his back into digging, he could move more earth in an hour than most men could in a day. Briggs Norton was the educated one. Had 2 years of college back east before his family's money ran out and he had to make his own way. He could read and write proper, knew mathematics, understood geology enough to impress the others with talk of quartz veins and mineral deposits. He kept a journal, the very one I found writing in it every night by lamplight, recording their progress and his thoughts in neat, careful script that got messier as the weeks went on. And then there was Tate. Just Tate. Nobody ever learned his last name, or if they did, they never spoke it. He was the youngest, couldn't have been more than 22, with a baby face that made him look even younger and a temper that made grown men step back. Tate had killed a man back in Kansas, self-defense, he claimed, though the law didn't see it that way. He'd been running ever since, and Gold Country seemed as good a place as any to disappear. They met in a supply town 30 miles east, all four heading in the same direction, all four looking for the same thing. Jed suggested they partner up. 4 men could work a claim faster than one, could defend it better too. They shook on it over whiskey in a nameless saloon, agreed to split everything equal 4 ways, and rode out the next morning with supplies enough to last through winter if they had to. The canyon they found was pristine, untouched, the kind of place that made a man's heart beat faster just looking at it. The creek ran clear and cold, winding through rock faces that showed promising color when the sun hit them right. They set up camp on a flat stretch near the water, built a sturdy cabin with timber from the surrounding hills, and started digging test holes to see what the ground would give them. It gave them gold. Not just traces, not just enough to keep them interested. Real gold, rich veins running through the quartz like lightning through storm clouds. They'd hit it bigger than any of them had dreamed. That first week after they struck the main vein, they pulled out more gold than most men saw in a lifetime. Nuggets the size of your thumb, dust so thick it looked like yellow snow. They celebrated that night, breaking out the good whiskey they'd been saving, passing the bottle around and making wild promises about what they'd do with their shares. Jed talked about buying a ranch in California, somewhere with green grass and no rocks to break your back digging. Colton wanted to go back east, set himself up as a gentleman, maybe start a business that didn't involve calluses or dirt under his fingernails. Briggs dreamed of finishing his education, maybe becoming a teacher or a scientist, using his money to make something of himself beyond just a lucky prospector. And Tate just wanted to stop running, wanted to be somewhere long enough to call it home, wanted to sleep without one eye open and one hand on his gun. They were happy that night. Happy in the way men are when fortune smiles and the future looks bright and all the hard days seem worth it finally. The whiskey flowed free, and they laughed and planned and promised they'd stick together, that this partnership was more than just business, it was brotherhood. But gold has a way of changing things, partner. Has a way of getting into a man's blood and souring it from the inside out. The town grew up around them as word spread about their strike. First, it was just a few other prospectors setting up claims nearby, hoping to catch some of the luck that seemed to follow Jed and his partners. Then came the merchants, a man named Samuel who opened a general store in a tent, old Sadie with her whiskey barrels and her knowing smile, a blacksmith who could repair tools and shoe horses. By the end of that first summer, Whiskey Creek was a proper boom town, maybe 200 souls, all of them chasing the same dream, all of them willing to work themselves to death for a chance at gold. The saloon that Sadie ran became the heart of it all, the place where deals were made and broken, where miners came to forget how hard they'd worked and how little they had to show for it. But for Jed and his partners, the saloon was something else. It was where they came every Saturday night to drink Sadie's good whiskey from the special barrel she kept just for them, the 4 men whose claim was making them all rich beyond measure. They'd sit at a corner table, the same table every week, and they'd drink and play cards and talk about everything except what was really on their minds, because things were changing between them, subtle as shadows lengthening at dusk. Jed started noticing that the gold they pulled out each week didn't quite match what should have been there based on the work they'd done. Not by much an ounce here, 2 ounces there, but enough to make him wonder. Enough to make him watch Colton a little closer, note how the gambler always volunteered to weigh the dust at the end of the day. Colton was noticing things, too, like how Briggs spent an awful lot of time in town talking to the assayer, asking questions about claims and ownership and legal rights, like how the educated man was always writing in that journal, recording details that seemed more like evidence than memories. Briggs saw the way Tate looked at the gold, saw the hunger there that went beyond normal greed, saw how the young man's hand drifted to his gun whenever they divided the shares, like he was calculating whether 3-way splits would be better than 4-way. And Tate noticed everything and said nothing, just watched with those young old eyes, his temper simmering below the surface, waiting for the excuse to boil over. The whiskey helped. Every Saturday night, they'd gather at that table and pass Sadie's special bottle around, and for a few hours they could pretend things were still good between them, could laugh at old jokes and make new plans and ignore the suspicion that was growing like mold in a damp cellar. Sadie saw it, of course. She'd been around men in gold long enough to recognize the signs. She told them once, gentle as she could, that maybe they ought to divide the claim now, while they were still friends, go their separate ways before the partnership turned poisonous. Jed had laughed it off, said they were fine, said they were brothers, but his laugh sounded hollow even to his own ears. The summer passed into fall, and the gold kept coming. They had more money than they'd ever dreamed of, more than any 4 men needed, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough, because the more they had, the more they had to lose. And the more they had to lose, the less they trusted each other. Briggs wrote about it in his journal in neat script that got shakier with each entry. October 12th. Jed accused Colton of shorting the weights today. Colton denied it, but I saw the look in his eyes. We are coming apart at the seams, and I don't know how to stitch us back together. That was the thing about gold, partner. It didn't just make men rich. It made them paranoid, made them see enemies in the faces of friends, made them count and recount and hide and watch, always watch, because everybody was stealing from everybody else. Or at least that's what everybody believed. The first snow came early that year, dusting the canyon walls in October when there should have been another month of clear weather. The miners who'd come hoping to strike it rich started pulling out, heading to lower ground before the passes closed. Within 2 weeks, Whiskey Creek's population dropped from 200 to maybe 30, just the diehards who figured they'd rather freeze than give up their claims. Jed and his partners stayed, of course. They had the richest claim in the canyon, maybe in the whole territory. Leaving would be like walking away from a fortune just because the weather got cold. So they stocked up on supplies, cut enough firewood to last through winter, and settled in to keep working their claim until the spring thaw. Sadie stayed too, bless her. Said the men who remained would need whiskey more than ever, and she wasn't about to abandon them to face winter sober. She kept the saloon open every night, the stove burning hot, the whiskey flowing for anyone with dust to pay for it. And every Saturday, Jed and Colton and Briggs and Tate would gather at their table, would drink from Sadie's special barrel, would pretend that everything was fine, even as the ice grew thicker between them than any snow outside. November came in cold and stayed cold. The creek froze solid, and the wind howled through the canyon like something wounded and angry. The 4 partners kept digging, kept pulling gold from the earth, kept dividing it into shares that never felt quite equal no matter how careful they measured. They stopped talking much, just worked in silence, each man alone with his thoughts and suspicions. At night they'd sit in the cabin they shared, the stove glowing red, and they'd clean their guns or sharpen their knives or write in journals, anything to avoid looking at each other for too long. The whiskey was all that held them together now. Every Saturday night without fail, They'd make the cold walk to Sadie's saloon, would sit at their table, would drink until the suspicion dulled and the laughter came easier. They'd made it a ritual, almost sacred. No matter how much they distrusted each other the other 6 days of the week, Saturday night they were partners. Saturday night they were brothers. But rituals can be broken, partner, and brothers can become enemies faster than you'd think. The journal entry from December 1st, 1873, written in Briggs's increasingly shaky hand. The snow is deep now, and we are truly isolated. If something were to happen here, no one would know until spring. That thought weighs on all of us, though no one speaks it aloud. Tonight we drink again. I pray it will be enough to keep us civilized. It wasn't enough. Nothing was going to be enough. Because the poison wasn't in the whiskey yet, it was in them, in their hearts and minds, growing stronger every day. But soon enough, partner, the poison would find its way into the bottle too. And when it did, Whiskey Creek would earn its place in the dark legends of the West. December settled over Whiskey Creek like a shroud, cold and heavy and final. The snow piled up 3 feet deep in places, drifting against the cabin walls and making the simple act of walking to the privy feel like an expedition. The 4 partners were well and truly cut off now, no one coming in, no one going out, just them and the gold and the growing darkness that had nothing to do with winter nights. They worked the claim every day the weather allowed, which wasn't many. When it was too cold or the wind too fierce, they'd stay in the cabin, each man occupying his own corner like animals establishing territory. Jed by the stove, always nearest the warmth. Colton near the door, always closest to escape. Briggs at the small table where he kept his journal and his books, and Tate moved around restless as a caged wolf, never settling, always watching. The gold kept accumulating. They stored it in 4 separate sacks now, one for each man's share, kept in a wooden trunk with 4 locks. Each partner had a key. They'd weigh and divide every nugget, every grain of dust, with a precision that bordered on obsession. And even then, somebody always felt cheated. "That nugget's bigger than mine," Tate would say, his voice flat and dangerous. "They weigh the same," Jed would counter, not bothering to hide his irritation anymore. "Weight ain't everything. That one's purer." And they'd argue about it, sometimes for hours, until somebody suggested they just trade and be done with it. But trading didn't help because then someone else felt slighted, and the whole process would start over. Colton stopped playing cards. Said he didn't see the point when nobody had anything to bet but gold they wouldn't risk and trust they'd already spent. He took to sitting by the window instead, staring out at the frozen creek, smoking cigarettes rolled thin and tight. Sometimes he'd laugh to himself, soft and bitter, and nobody would ask what he found so funny. Briggs kept writing in his journal, but the entries got shorter and darker. He'd given up recording their daily gold haul or describing the weather. Now he just wrote observations about the other 3, studying them like a scientist studying specimens, trying to predict when and how the partnership would finally shatter. Colton is drinking more. He wrote one night. Not drunk, but never quite sober either. He's getting ready for something. I can see it in how he checks his pistol every morning, spinning the cylinder, counting bullets he already knows are there. About Jed, he hardly sleeps anymore. I wake in the night and see him watching us, his hand under his pillow where he keeps his knife. He's made his decision, I think, just waiting for the right moment. About Tate. The boy is pure rage held together by fear. Dangerous. Combination. He'll kill us all given half a chance and reason enough. I suspect both will come soon. About himself, I should leave. Take my share and risk the snow rather than stay here waiting for violence. But I'm as trapped by greed as the others. Can't walk away from the gold any more than I can walk away from my own shadow. So I stay, and I write, and I wait. Saturday nights became something different. They still made the trek to Sadie's saloon, still gathered at their corner table, still drank from the special barrel she kept for them. But now it felt less like brotherhood and more like a temporary truce in an undeclared war. They'd drink in near silence, each man alone with his thoughts, and the whiskey that used to bring laughter now just made them morose. Sadie watched them with sad eyes. She'd seen partnerships dissolve before, had watched men who'd been friends turn into enemies over claims and cards and women. But this felt different somehow, darker. These four had started out better than most hadn't been friends, but had been friendly enough. Now they looked at each other like men calculating murder. "You boys need to talk this out," she told them one Saturday evening, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever's eating at you, you need to speak it plain and settle it before it settles you." "Nothing to talk about," Jed said, not meeting her eyes. "We're fine." "You ain't fine. Any fool can see that." "Then any fool can mind their own business," Colton said, his smile sharp as broken glass. Sadie sighed and poured them more whiskey, knowing it wouldn't help but not knowing what else to do. The barrel they drank from was special, she'd told them that the first time they sat at her table. It was old Kentucky whiskey, aged in charred oak, smooth as silk and strong as sin. She'd brought it west herself, carried it on a wagon through dust and heat and across rivers that nearly swallowed it whole. It was the best whiskey within 200 miles, and she only shared it with people she liked. She still liked them, despite everything. Could see the good men they'd been under, the suspicious, paranoid shells they'd become. But liking them didn't mean she was blind to what was coming. "You boys ought to divide that claim come spring," she said quietly. "Go your separate ways before something happens you can't take back." "We're partners," Briggs said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Partners stick together. Partners trust each other," Sadie countered. "You four don't trust each other far as you could throw a bull. That ain't partnership. That's just four men waiting for an excuse to draw." Tate stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the wooden floor. "I'm getting some air." He walked out into the December cold without his coat, and nobody went after him. They just watched through the window as he stood in the snow, his breath rising in clouds, his fists clenched at his sides like he was fighting himself. "Boy's gonna explode one of these days," Colton observed, swirling whiskey in his cup. "We're all gonna explode," Jed said. "Just a matter of when and who goes first." The barrel sat between them on the table, sweating in the heat from the saloon stove. It was half empty now, had been supplying their Saturday night rituals for months. Sadie figured it had maybe 2 more months of drinking left in it, 3 if they were careful, which meant it would last exactly as long as winter did. "You ever think about poison?" Briggs asked suddenly, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. The table went quiet. Even the other patrons in the saloon seemed to stop talking, though that might have been imagination. "What kind of question is that?" Jed asked carefully, just thinking out loud. "Read about it in a book once, how easy it would be to poison someone's drink if you had a mind to. Just a little something in the whiskey, and by the time they realized what was happening, it'd be too late." "That's a hell of a thing to think about," Colton said, his hand moving closer to his pistol without seeming to mean to. "Is it?" Briggs looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "Seems to me we're all thinking it. Might as well say it out loud. Nobody's poisoning nobody," Sadie interjected firmly. "Not in my establishment. You want to kill each other, you do it outside and away from my whiskey." But the thought was out there now, hanging in the air like smoke. They all looked at the barrel differently after that, looked at their cups with suspicion before drinking. Who would pour? Who would serve? Could you trust the whiskey if it came from someone else's hand? They started pouring their own, each man reaching for the barrel himself, filling his own cup from the spigot. Seemed safer that way. Seemed like it removed at least one opportunity for betrayal. "But partner, here's the thing about poison and trust once you start suspecting it. Everything tastes bitter. Everything feels wrong. You can't relax, can't enjoy anything, because you're too busy watching and wondering and waiting for the first sign that something's gone bad. Christmas came and went without celebration. They worked the claim on Christmas Day, same as any other, nobody bothering to acknowledge the holiday. What was there to celebrate? They were rich men who hated each other. trapped in a frozen canyon with nothing to do but dig gold and count the days until they could either escape or finish what was building between them. Briggs wrote in his journal on Christmas night, "We didn't even drink tonight. Each man stayed in his corner of the cabin, cleaning weapons or counting gold or just staring at walls. This is how it ends, I think. Not with violence, though that will come, but with this, the slow death of whatever it was that made us human. We're becoming something else out here. Something cold and mean and barely alive." The next Saturday, they went to Sadie's out of habit more than desire. Sat at their table like always, but the barrel between them might as well have been a chasm they couldn't cross. Nobody wanted to drink first. Nobody wanted to be the one to pour. They just sat there, 4 men staring at a barrel of whiskey like it was a coiled snake ready to strike. "This is foolish," Sadie finally said, exasperated. She grabbed 4 cups, lined them up, and filled each one herself from the barrel. Then she took 1 cup at random and drank deep from it, swallowing 3 good mouthfuls before setting it down. "There, it ain't poisoned. Now drink and stop acting like children." They drank, but it didn't taste like whiskey anymore. Tasted like suspicion and fear and the knowledge that something bad was coming, inevitable as spring following winter. The wind that night was particularly fierce, howling through the canyon with a sound that was almost human, almost like screaming or laughing. Hard to tell which, and maybe it didn't matter. Whiskey Creek had its own voice now, its own song, and what it sang about was death and gold and the poison that lived in men's hearts long before it ever touched their lips. "I'm done after tonight," Tate said suddenly, his voice cutting through the wind. "Come spring, I'm taking my share and leaving. Don't care where, just away from here. Away from all of you." "Can't leave before we finish working the claim," Jed said. "Contract says we work it together until it plays out or we all agree to quit." "Contract was made between partners," Tate shot back. "We ain't partners anymore. We're just 4 thieves guarding gold from each other. You signed your name," Colton pointed out. "Your word's bond, same as ours." "My word's worth exactly as much as yours," Tate said with a bitter laugh, "which is to say, nothing at all." They argued about it for an hour, voices rising until other patrons started leaving, not wanting to be around when whatever was building finally broke loose. Sadie tried to calm them, tried to reason, but reason had left this partnership months ago. Finally, Jed stood up. "Fine, we'll discuss it in the morning, but tonight, we drink. We made a ritual of this, and I intend to honor it even if nothing else between us is worth honoring." He reached for the barrel, filled 4 cups to the brim, and passed them around. "To the richest claim in the territory," he said, raising his cup, "and to the 4 biggest fools who ever worked it." They drank, all 4 of them, in unison. The whiskey burned going down, as always, but tonight it tasted different somehow, sharper, darker, like it had been waiting for this moment, this night, this particular gathering of 4 men who'd forgotten how to trust each other. They finished their drinks in silence, then walked back to the cabin through snow that was falling thick and heavy. Behind them, the barrel sat on the table, still sweating in the heat of the saloon, still half full of whiskey that had tasted wrong, still waiting for the final Saturday night when everything would come to its bloody conclusion. But that night wasn't quite yet, partner. First there had to be more suspicion, more accusation, more of the slow poison that had nothing to do with whiskey and everything to do with gold. The cabin door closed behind them with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and outside the wind hummed through the frozen creek bed, singing its song of things to come, singing about blood in the snow and betrayal in the dark, singing about 4 men and a barrel and a reckoning that would echo through this canyon for decades after they were all gone. The wind sang and Whiskey Creek listened, and morning came cold and merciless as death itself. The storm rolled in on a Saturday in late January, moving down from the high peaks like God's own wrath made visible. The sky went from pale winter blue to bruised purple to black in the space of an hour, and the wind picked up until it was screaming through the canyon loud, enough to make the cabin walls shudder. "We should stay in tonight." Briggs said, watching the storm through the cabin's single window. "Ain't worth freezing to death for whiskey." But Jed was already pulling on his coat, wrapping a scarf around his face. "We made a promise. Saturday night, we drink at Sadie's. Storm or no storm, since when do you care about promises?" Tate asked from his corner. But he was getting dressed too, checking his pistol before tucking it into his belt. Colton laughed, cold and mirthless. "We all know why we're going. Ain't about the whiskey, ain't about promises. We're going because we're afraid of what might happen if we stay here together all night with nothing to do but think and watch each other." Nobody argued with that assessment. They made the trek to the saloon hunched against wind that felt like knives made of ice. The snow was coming down sideways now, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Lightning flashed rare for a winter storm, but it happened sometimes in these mountains, turning the world white and black and white again like a photograph being taken by God himself. Thunder followed, rolling through the canyon and echoing off the rock walls until it sounded like the earth was tearing itself apart. Sadie's place was nearly empty when they arrived. Just old Pete, who'd been too drunk to leave before the storm hit, and a couple of prospectors who'd decided, the same as Jed and his partners, that freezing to death was preferable to whatever waited in their lonely cabins. "You boys are crazy," Sadie said, but she was smiling as she poured their first round. "Storm like this, sensible men stay home." "Never claimed to be sensible," Jed said, taking his usual seat at the corner table. The barrel sat there waiting, same as always. Half empty now, maybe a little less. The whiskey inside sloshed quietly when Colton bumped the table sitting down, a sound like secrets being whispered in an empty church. They drank their first cups in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The thunder came regular now, every minute or so, shaking the building's foundations. Lightning turned the windows into rectangles of pure white light, there and gone so fast you almost thought you'd imagined it. "Hell of a storm," Pete observed from the bar, his words slurred but his observation accurate. "Hell of a night for it," Colton agreed. "Something felt different tonight, partner." The air in the saloon was thick and close despite the cold, heavy with more than just tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes. It felt like the moment before a fist fight, that electric tension when you know violence is coming but you don't know exactly when or from where. Sadie felt it too. She kept glancing at the corner table, at the four men who sat there like they were attending a funeral, their own maybe. She'd seen them deteriorate over the months, watched friendship turn to suspicion, turn to something darker, but tonight felt like an ending, felt final. "You boys be careful with that barrel," she said, more for something to say than because she thought they needed the warning. "It's got maybe 2 more good nights left in it." "Then we better make this one count," Jed said, reaching for the spigot. He filled his cup, then Colton's, then Briggs's, then Tate's, passed them around careful-like, making sure everyone saw that he wasn't doing anything sneaky, wasn't adding anything that shouldn't be there. The fact that he had to be so obvious about it said everything about where they'd ended up. "To the last days of winter," Jed said, raising his cup. "May spring come soon and take us far from here." "To spring," the others echoed, and they drank. The whiskey tasted the same as always, smooth, strong, with that bite of oak and smoke that made Kentucky whiskey worth crossing continents for. Nothing wrong with it, nothing different. Just whiskey being whiskey, serving its eternal purpose of dulling pain and loosening tongues and making bad decisions feel like good ones. They played cards, or tried to, but nobody's heart was in it, and after half an hour they gave up, just sat there drinking and listening to the storm. Thunder and lightning, regular as a heartbeat, regular as death. "I found gold in your bag," Colton said suddenly, his voice conversational but his eyes hard as flint. The table went still. Even the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. "What are you talking about?" Jed asked carefully. "In your personal bag, the one you keep under your bunk. I was looking for my spare socks. They'd gotten mixed up in the wash, and I found gold dust in your bag that wasn't counted in your share. About 3 ounces worth. You went through my things?" Answer the question. Jed's face darkened, a vein throbbing in his temple. I found that dust separate from the claim, little pocket near the surface. Didn't tell you because it wasn't any of your damn business. Anything from our claim is our business. Tate said, leaning forward. Contract says so. Every ounce gets divided 4 ways. It wasn't from our claim, I said. Then where? Briggs asked, his voice quiet but demanding. Where exactly did you find 3 ounces of gold on land we've been working for 6 months without any of us noticing? Jed didn't answer, just reached for the barrel and poured himself another cup. He's been stealing from us, Colton said flatly. How long, Jed? How much have you skimmed? I haven't skimmed anything, you goddamn. Then where's the gold from? I told you. You told us nothing. Colton was standing now, his hand near his pistol. You gave us a story that don't make sense, and you expect us to just accept it. I don't expect anything from any of you, Jed said, his voice dangerous and low. Certainly not trust, since none of us have any of that left. Lightning flashed, and in its brief illumination they all saw each other clearly. 4 men pushed to the edge, 4 men one wrong word away from violence. Thunder followed, rattling the windows, rattling their nerves. Maybe we should all admit what we've been doing, Briggs said. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and tossed it on the table. It landed with a heavy thunk. That's 4 ounces. I've been keeping it separate, was planning to take it when I left. Figured you'd all been doing the same, so why shouldn't I? I knew it, Tate said with a bark of laughter. The educated man, keeping records and playing honest while stealing from the rest of us. What about you? Briggs shot back. You going to sit there and claim you haven't been pocketing dust? Never said I hadn't, just said I knew you were. Colton reached into his own pocket and pulled out a pouch, smaller than Briggs's but still substantial. 2 ounces, he said. Been saving it for months. Insurance policy in case you all decided to cut me out. They all looked at Jed, who stared back defiant. I ain't showing you nothing. My gold's mine, and what you all got is yours, and the claim share is in the trunk back at the cabin where it belongs. So we've all been thieves, Sadie said from behind the bar, her voice sad. 4 partners who started out honest and ended up stealing from each other. That's what gold does, boys. That's what it always does. Shut your mouth, woman, Tate snapped. This ain't your concern. It's my concern when you're sitting in my establishment planning murder, Sadie shot back. Because that's what's coming next, ain't it? Now that you all know you've been stealing, now that the truth's out, what's to stop you from deciding 3-way splits are better than 4-way? Nobody's planning murder, Jed said, but his hand was under the table, and everyone knew what was there. You're all planning murder, Sadie said. Been planning it for months. Just been waiting for excuse enough to go through with it. The storm chose that moment to throw its worst at them. A crack of thunder so loud it felt like the sky splitting open, lightning that turned the whole world white for 3 full seconds. And in that white light, they all saw each other's faces clearly, saw the fear and the greed and the hate that had been building since the day they struck gold. Pour us another round, Colton said, his voice strange and tight. 1 more drink before we settle this. Jed reached for the barrel. His hand was shaking from anger or fear or maybe just the cold, hard to say which. He filled 4 cups from the spigot, the whiskey splashing and spilling in his haste. Passed them around without ceremony, without his usual careful distribution. They raised their cups together one last time. To partnership, Briggs said, and it sounded like an epitaph. They drank deep, all of them, draining their cups to the dregs. The whiskey burned worse than usual, sharp and bitter, or maybe that was just their mood souring everything. They set their cups down and stared at each other across the scarred wooden table. The lightning flashed again, the thunder rolled, and something shifted in the air, something final and terrible. I feel strange, Tate said, his voice suddenly slurred. Dizzy. Me too, Briggs echoed, putting his hand to his forehead. Like the room spinning. Colton tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, and he fell back into his chair with a crash. What the hell? Jed was looking at his hands, watching them shake, watching them turn pale and clammy. Something's wrong. Something's... The whiskey, Sadie said, her voice rising in horror. Oh, God, the whiskey. She ran to the barrel, yanked off the lid, and stared inside. The whiskey looked normal, smelled normal, but when she dipped her finger in and tasted it, her face went white as the lightning still flashing outside. Poison, she whispered. Someone put poison in the barrel. The four partners looked at each other, and in their eyes was the terrible knowledge that one of them sitting at this very table had poisoned their shared whiskey, had decided that murder was preferable to partnership, that three-way splits justified killing a fourth man, only they'd all drunk from the same barrel, all poured from the same spigot, all drank from the same poison. Who? Jed gasped, his face contorting in pain. Which one of you? But nobody answered. Maybe because they didn't know. Maybe because in that moment, with poison coursing through their veins, it didn't matter who'd done it. What mattered was that they were dying, all four of them, killed by their own greed and suspicion, and the barrel they'd made sacred. Tate was first to fall, pitching forward onto the table, his eyes rolling back. Briggs followed, sliding from his chair to the floor, where he convulsed twice and then went still. Colton made it to the door, trying to escape as if fresh air could save him, but he collapsed in the doorway, half in and half out of the saloon, already gone. Jed lasted longest, but only by seconds. He looked at Sadie with eyes full of rage and pain and something that might have been regret. The gold, he managed to whisper. What about the gold? Then he fell, and the cabin went quiet except for the storm still raging outside. Sadie stood there in shock, surrounded by four dead men and a barrel of poisoned whiskey. The lightning flashed, illuminating their bodies in stark detail. Tate face down on the table, Briggs crumpled on the floor, Colton sprawled in the doorway, and Jed slumped in his chair like he'd just fallen asleep. The barrel sat between them all, sweating in the heat of the stove, its poison delivered and its purpose served. And somewhere in the storm, the wind carried away the sound of Sadie screaming. Morning came gray and cold, the storm finally spent, but leaving behind 3 feet of new snow that made the world look pure and clean. A lie, of course. Nothing in Whiskey Creek was pure anymore. Sadie hadn't slept, had spent the night sitting on her porch with a rifle across her lap, staring at the 4 bodies lying in her saloon, trying to understand what had happened, trying to figure out which one had poisoned the whiskey, and why they'd been stupid or desperate enough to drink from a barrel they'd tainted themselves. Unless it hadn't been one of them, unless someone else had access to that barrel between Saturday nights. But who and why? She had no answers, just questions and 4 dead men and a terror growing in her gut that this wasn't over. Couldn't be over, because $30,000 in gold sat in a cabin with nobody to claim it, and that kind of money had a way of attracting trouble like flies to a corpse. She was right to be worried. The first people who came were the prospectors from the storm the night before, emerging from their cabins when the sun got high enough to make travel possible. They stopped at the saloon for coffee and news and found instead 4 bodies and 1 terrified woman. What happened? They asked, though they could guess. Poison, Sadie said simply. In the whiskey, all 4 of them drank it and died within minutes. The prospectors looked at each other, then at the bodies, then at the barrel still sitting on the corner table like an invitation. Which one did it? Don't know. Don't care. They're dead now, all of them. What about their claim? What about the gold? And there it was, the question that mattered more than murder, more than justice, more than 4 men lying dead because of greed and suspicion. What about the gold? I don't know, Sadie said again. I suppose it belongs to whoever has claim to their estate. Family, maybe, or the territory. Not my concern and not yours, neither. But it was their concern, whether she liked it or not, because within hours, half the remaining population of Whiskey Creek had heard about the deaths, and they'd all come to the same conclusion that gold was up for grabs now. Finders keepers. First come, first served. The rush started before they'd even buried the bodies. Men descended on the partners' cabin like vultures on carrion, breaking down the door, searching every corner, tearing up floorboards and digging through personal belongings. They found the trunk with the 4 locks and smashed it open with an axe. Inside were 4 leather bags, each one marked with initials J, H, C, W, B, N, T. The gold was divided on the spot, right there in the cabin, with a dozen men watching and arguing about shares. Some claimed they'd helped the partners work the claim at various times and deserved a cut. Others said they'd loaned them supplies and were owed money. Everyone had a reason why they deserved some of that gold. Sadie watched from a distance, disgusted but not surprised. This was how it went in mining camps. Death was just an opportunity for the living to profit. Morality was a luxury that gold country couldn't afford. The body of Jed Harker was found to have a small pouch in his inner pocket, 3 ounces, like Colton had accused him of hiding. Colton's body yielded 2 ounces from his boot. Briggs had 4 ounces sewn into the lining of his coat, and Tate Young, Angry Tate, had the most of all. 6 ounces distributed throughout his clothing, hidden in places that spoke of paranoia and planning. They'd all been stealing, all been preparing to take more than their share, all been right to suspect each other, because each of them was guilty of exactly what they accused the others of doing. The claim itself became contested ground. A dozen different men tried to file ownership, each one claiming some connection to the original partners that gave them rights. Fights broke out in the snow, bloody and brief. One man got stabbed over it, another got shot in the leg. The law was too far away to matter, and even if it hadn't been, nobody in Whiskey Creek much cared what the law said about anything. By the end of that first week after the deaths, the camp had descended into chaos. The gold was scattered among too many hands, the claim was being worked by whoever had the guns to hold it, and trust what little had existed was completely gone. Sadie kept her saloon open because she didn't know what else to do. Men still came to drink, though they eyed that barrel in the corner with suspicion and fear. She'd dumped the poisoned whiskey into the snow, watched it melt yellow patches in the white drifts, and wondered if the ground itself would be poisoned now. Wondered if anything that grew there would carry the taint of what had happened. The barrel itself became an object of fascination and horror. Nobody would touch it. Nobody would move it from its place on the corner table. It sat there empty, sweating in the heat of the stove like it was still full, like it was waiting for something. Some men claimed to hear it whispering at night. Others said they saw faces in the wood grain, the faces of the 4 dead partners, twisted in agony, warning away anyone who got too close. Sadie thought they were being foolish and superstitious, but she didn't move the barrel either. Something about it felt wrong now, tainted beyond cleaning, cursed beyond redemption. February turned to March, and the snow began to melt. The pass opened enough that people could leave, and many did. Took whatever gold they'd managed to claim and fled Whiskey Creek like it was on fire. They told stories in the towns they passed through, tales that grew wilder with each telling. 4 partners poisoned by their own greed, gold cursed by betrayal, a barrel that whispered names of the dead. Some folks came to see for themselves, drawn by morbid curiosity or the lingering hope of finding gold the others had missed. They'd poke through the abandoned cabin, would sit at the corner table in Sadie's saloon, would stare at the empty barrel and wonder what had really happened that storm night when 4 men drank poison together. A few tried to work the original claim, but it had played out fast under the desperate digging of too many hands. What had been a rich vein became just empty rock in a matter of weeks. The gold was gone, taken or lost, or maybe never as much as everyone had believed. Dreams and greed have a way of inflating things beyond reality. By April, Whiskey Creek was more ghost town than boom town. Maybe 20 people remained, most of them too stubborn or too broke to leave. Sadie was one of them. This was her place, her saloon, her barrel. She'd stay until the end, whatever that looked like. She moved the bodies herself, eventually. Nobody else would do it, and she couldn't stand leaving them in her saloon any longer. She dragged them one by one out to a clearing near the creek and buried them in shallow graves that the spring melt would probably wash away. Said a few words over each one, not religious exactly, but at least respectful. They'd been her customers, her friends in a way. They deserved better than to be left where they fell. But she didn't bury the barrel, couldn't bring herself to do it. It belonged in the saloon, belonged at that corner table. It was part of the story now, part of the legend that Whiskey Creek was becoming. You couldn't separate one from the other any more than you could separate poison from the whiskey it was dissolved in. The spring brought prospectors looking for new claims, men who'd heard the stories but figured they could succeed where the four partners had failed. They'd show up with pickaxes and pans and optimism, would spend a few days or weeks digging in the canyon walls, and would leave disappointed or dead. The creek had given up its gold. What remained was just rock and regret. Some of those prospectors would stop at Sadie's for a drink and a meal. They'd ask about the 4 dead men, about the poisoned whiskey, about the gold that had been found and lost. Sadie would tell them what she knew, which wasn't much. The mystery of who'd poisoned the barrel had never been solved. Maybe it never would be. You think one of them did it? A young prospector asked her one evening, nodding toward the empty barrel. One of the 4 partners? Sadie considered this while she wiped down the bar. Maybe. Or maybe someone else who wanted them dead and their gold available. Or maybe, she paused, wondering if she should voice the thought that had been growing in her mind. Maybe the barrel poisoned itself. The prospector laughed. A barrel can't poison itself, ma'am. That's just superstition talking. Is it? Sadie looked at the barrel, at the way it seemed to gleam even in the dim lamplight. You spend enough time around bad men and bad deeds, maybe things absorb that badness. Maybe that barrel soaked up so much greed and suspicion and hate that it couldn't help but turn poisonous. Maybe it was just reflecting back what was put into it. That's a pretty story, the prospector said. But poison's poison. Someone put it there deliberate. Maybe he was right. Probably he was right. But Sadie wasn't so sure anymore. She'd seen things in mining camps that couldn't be explained by simple logic. Had seen claims that seemed cursed, men who carried bad luck like a disease, places where death visited more often than it should. Whiskey Creek was becoming one of those places. The creek itself had gone strange, wouldn't flow right even when the snowmelt came heavy, would dry up in patches for no reason, would run red sometimes like it was bleeding. Animals avoided the area. Birds wouldn't nest in the canyon. Even the wind sounded wrong, humming through the rocks with that peculiar tone that set teeth on edge and made hair stand up on necks. The gold was gone, but the greed remained, soaked into the ground like blood soaked into dirt. You could feel it in the air, taste it on your tongue when the wind blew just right. The 4 partners had died, but their hunger lived on, infecting anyone who came looking for what they'd left behind. By summer, Whiskey Creek was truly abandoned except for Sadie. The last few holdouts had given up and moved on to other camps, other hopes. She stayed out of stubbornness more than anything else, refusing to let the town die completely while she still drew breath. She sat in her empty saloon most nights, drinking alone, staring at that barrel on the corner table. Sometimes she'd walk over and put her hand on it, feeling the wood still sweating despite the summer heat, still cold to the touch like it was full of something frozen and malevolent. What happened? She'd ask it sometimes, her voice echoing in the empty room. Which one of them did it? Or was it you? Did you decide that 4 men drunk on greed deserved to die? The barrel never answered, of course, just sat there silent and accusatory, a monument to everything that had gone wrong in Whiskey Creek, the gold that wouldn't stay buried. That was the truth of it. Even scattered and stolen and spent, even disappeared and lost, it was still here in a way that mattered more than physical presence. It haunted this place like a ghost made of greed, like a curse that couldn't be lifted because nobody remembered how to cast it in the first place. And the barrel waited for the next fool who'd come looking for easy fortune, waited to tell its story to anyone who'd listen, waited to prove that some poisons never lose their potency, no matter how much time passes or how many people try to wash them away. The gold was gone. The men were dead. But the reckoning was just beginning. 20 years passed before anyone came looking with real intent. 20 years of Whiskey Creek sitting empty and silent, its buildings collapsing into ruin, its streets overgrown with sage and tumbleweed. The creek bed stayed dry those 2 decades, just a winding scar through the canyon that hummed when the wind blew right. Sadie had left in '76, finally admitting defeat. She'd sold her barrel to a traveling merchant for almost nothing, 50 cents, enough to buy coffee and flour and get her to the next town. She'd told the merchant about the poison, about the 4 dead men, but he'd just laughed and said every old barrel had stories. He'd resell it somewhere for twice what he paid, and some fool would fill it with whiskey again and never know its history. The saloon collapsed in the winter of '81. The roof gave way under heavy snow, and the walls followed soon after. Within 5 years, you couldn't tell there'd been a building there at all, except for the foundation stones and maybe some rotted timber if you knew where to look. The cabin where the 4 partners had lived and died lasted longer, but not by much. Prospectors passing through would sometimes camp there for a night, but none of them stayed long. Something about the place felt wrong, they said, made their horses nervous, made their dogs refuse to enter, made sleep difficult and dreams worse. By 1893, Whiskey Creek was as dead as a town could be. Even the name was fading from maps and memories. Just another failed mining camp in a West that was full of them, another place where dreams had gone to die alongside the dreamers. Then Silas Morrison rode in. He was 23 years old, fresh from Kentucky, where he'd been working his daddy's tobacco farm until a bad harvest and a worse gambling debt had forced him to head west. He'd heard the old stories, everyone had heard them by then, passed down and embellished until they were more legend than truth. 4 miners struck it rich, killed each other over greed, left their gold hidden somewhere in a canyon that hummed like a whiskey bottle when the wind blew. Silas didn't believe most of it. Stories always got exaggerated in the telling, but he believed in the gold, or at least in the possibility of gold. Figured if 4 men had died over it, there must have been something worth dying for, and if it had never been found, well, maybe he'd be the lucky one. He rode into Whiskey Creek on a hot August afternoon when the sun was beaten down and the dust devils were dancing in the abandoned streets. His horse didn't like the place, kept tossing its head and trying to turn back, but Silas pushed on until he reached what remained of the town center. The ruins weren't much to look at. Broken timber, rusted metal, foundations filled with drift sand and rattlesnakes. But Silas had studied what maps he could find, had talked to old-timers who remembered the boom years, and he had a pretty good idea where things used to stand. He found the saloon foundation first, or what he thought was the saloon, hard to tell when everything was collapsed and overgrown. But there was a stone chimney still standing, and scattered around it were dozens of broken bottles, their glass turned purple by years of desert sun. And half buried in the drift sand, weathered but intact, was a barrel. Silas's heart started beating faster when he saw it. A whiskey barrel, old and worn, but solid. The wood was gray with age and split in places, but the iron band still held it together. It was lying on its side, partially covered by sand that had blown in over the years. He knelt beside it, brushing away the dirt, running his hands over the aged wood. Could this be it? The barrel from the stories? The one that had held the poisoned whiskey? Logic said no. Logic said any barrel left outside for 20 years would have rotted to nothing. But this one hadn't. This one had survived somehow, waiting in the ruins like it knew someone would eventually come looking. Silas tried to lift it, but found it surprisingly heavy. He rolled it over, and that's when he heard it, a sloshing sound from inside. Liquid. After 20 years exposed to the elements, in a barrel that should have leaked dry long ago, there was still liquid inside. His hands were shaking. As he pried off the wooden lid, half rotten but still fitted tight, the smell hit him first, whiskey, unmistakable, that sweet sharp scent of aged bourbon. And when he looked inside, the barrel was half full of amber liquid that looked as fresh as the day it was poured. Impossible. Had to be impossible. But there it was, defying logic and time, whiskey that shouldn't exist but did. Silas had brought no cup, so he dipped his hand in and brought it to his lips. The taste was incredible, smooth and rich, with notes of oak and smoke and something he couldn't quite name, but that made him think of church bells and thunderstorms and the color of old blood. He drank deeper, cupping both hands to bring more to his mouth. It burned going down, but in a good way, warming his belly and making his head feel light and pleasant. This was the best whiskey he'd ever tasted, better than anything he'd had back in Kentucky where they knew whiskey. He sat back against the old foundation stones, the barrel between his knees, and drank again and again. The afternoon sun seemed less harsh now, the ruined town less depressing. Maybe this place wasn't dead after all. Maybe it was just waiting, like the barrel had been waiting, for someone to come and wake it up. The shadows grew longer as he drank, and somewhere in the back of his mind a voice tried to warn him that something was wrong. That whiskey didn't stay good for 20 years in the open air, that no barrel would hold liquid that long, that the taste, that unusual note he couldn't quite identify, it tasted like poison might taste if poison could be delicious. But he ignored the voice. He ignored the way the shadows seemed to be moving even though the sun was still and steady. Ignored how the humming from the dry creek bed was getting louder, almost like voices now, almost like 4 men arguing in the distance. He drank until the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls red and gold and purple. Drank until his vision started blurring and his stomach started cramping. Drank until he realized, too late, what he'd done. The poison wasn't in the whiskey. The whiskey was the poison. All of it, every drop. Aged in hatred and greed and betrayal until it became something that could kill just by being itself. Silas tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He fell forward, catching himself on his hands, staring at the ground that seemed to be moving like water. The humming from the creek bed was definitely voices now, definitely words, though he couldn't quite make them out through the roaring in his ears. He managed to look up, managed to see 4 figures standing at the edge of the ruins. 4 men in miners' clothes, their faces shadowed by their hats, their bodies somehow less solid than they should be. They were watching him, waiting for him. Who? Silas tried to ask, but his throat wouldn't work right. The poison was in him now, working its way through his blood, stopping his heart beat by beat. One of the figures stepped closer, Jed, though Silas didn't know the name. Just knew that this was the leader, the one the others looked to, the one who'd poured the last round from the barrel that night 20 years ago. "You shouldn't have drunk it," Jed said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "That whiskey ain't for the living, not anymore. Please," Silas managed to whisper. "I didn't know. Neither did we," another voice said Colton, smiling that dangerous smile even in death. "But we learned. Oh, we learned." The figures were closer now, surrounding him, looking down at where he lay dying in the ruins of a saloon that had been dead longer than he'd been alive. They didn't seem angry exactly, more like sad, like they were sorry he'd made the same mistake they had, sorry that the barrel had claimed another victim. The gold? Silas gasped, because even dying, even with poison burning through his veins, he had to know. "Where's the gold?" The 4 figures laughed, and it was the saddest sound Silas had ever heard. "There ain't no gold," Jed said. "Not anymore. It got spent and stolen and scattered to the winds. All that's left is the barrel and the poison and the memory of what we did to each other over it." "That ain't fair," Silas whispered. "Nothing about this is fair, boy," Tate said, and even his young face looked ancient with regret. "That's the whole point. We got what we deserved, and so do you." The last thing Silas saw before the darkness took him was Briggs kneeling beside him, the educated man's face sympathetic and terrible. "The barrel waits," Briggs whispered. "It always waits, waiting for the next fool who thinks greed is worth dying for, waiting for the next soul who can't learn from other people's mistakes." Then Silas Morrison, age 23, died in the ruins of Whiskey Creek with poisoned whiskey on his lips and gold dust dreams in his eyes. Died alone except for 4 ghosts who'd been waiting 20 years for company. Died and became part of the story, part of the legend, part of the warning that nobody ever heeds. The sun set fully, and the canyon went dark. The four figures faded like smoke and wind, returning to whatever place they went when they weren't haunting their old stomping grounds. The barrel sat there, still half full, still waiting, still sweating in the desert heat like it was fresh from the distillery. And the creek bed hummed its lonely song, adding one more name to the chorus. 4 voices became 5. 4 dead men became 5. 5 fools who'd reach for gold and grab poison instead. Morning would bring travelers who'd find Silas's body, who'd bury him in a shallow grave not far from where the 4 partners lay, who'd see the barrel and wonder but wouldn't touch it, wouldn't drink from it, would leave it exactly where it was because some things are meant to stay buried even when they refuse to stay buried. The barrel waited, it always waited, and somewhere in its depths, whiskey that shouldn't exist continued to age, continued to poison, continued to promise riches to anyone foolish enough to believe. The reckoning at Whiskey Creek had claimed another victim, but it wasn't done yet, would never be done, because some places collect death like rain collects in a barrel, and some stories keep repeating until someone finally learns the lesson they're meant to teach. The lesson was simple. Greed kills, whiskey remembers, and some barrels hold more than just liquor. They hold the weight of all the sins that have ever been committed in their presence. Silas had learned that lesson too late, just like the 4 partners before him, just like everyone who would come after, drawn by stories of gold and blind to the poison that was the real treasure Whiskey Creek had to offer. The wind blew through the canyon that night, carrying the sound of 5 voices arguing about shares that didn't exist anymore, carrying the scent of whiskey that should have evaporated decades ago, carrying the promise that the barrel would wait, patient as death itself, for the next fool who couldn't resist its call. They found Silas's body 3 weeks later, or what was left of it after the coyotes and vultures had their turn. 2 prospectors heading north looking for color in some played-out claims spotted his horse first. The animal was still tied to a post near the ruins, nearly dead from dehydration but too loyal or too stupid to break free and find water. The men followed the horse's desperate gaze and found Silas. He was lying on his back, arms outstretched, face turned toward the sky with an expression frozen on it that made both men take a step back. It wasn't quite horror, wasn't quite pain. It was something worse, a look of understanding, of terrible clarity, like Silas had seen something in his final moments that no living man should ever see. His lips were stained dark, almost black. His hands were clutched in fists so tight they had to break his fingers to straighten them for burial. And next to him, half buried in the drift sand but still gleaming with moisture, sat the barrel. "Don't touch it." The older prospector, a man named Dutch, said when his partner moved toward it, "Whatever killed this boy, it came from there." "How do you know?" "Look at his mouth. Look at his hands. He drank something that poisoned him, and there ain't nothing else here to drink from." Dutch circled the barrel carefully, like it was a rattlesnake coiled to strike. "This is that barrel, the one from the stories. That's just legend. That barrel would be rotted to nothing by now. Then you explain how it's still here, still in one piece, still got liquid in it if that sloshing sound means anything. They buried Silas in a shallow grave. The ground was too hard for anything deeper and marked it with stones. Dutch said a few words over him, something about dust and ashes and God having mercy on fools. Then they took his horse and whatever supplies they could salvage from his gear and rode out of Whiskey Creek fast as their animals would carry them. But they talked. Oh, they talked. In every saloon and supply store and mining camp they passed through. They told the story of finding Silas's body and the barrel that had killed him. The story spread like wildfire through dry grass, picking up details and embellishments with each telling. Some versions had Silas's body covered in gold dust, like he'd been rolling in it before he died. Others claimed his eyes had been turned to actual gold, transformed by some alchemical poison in the whiskey. A few said his ghost could be seen wandering the ruins at night, still searching for the treasure that had lured him to his death. None of it was true, of course, but truth and legend don't much care for each other in the West. Legend wins out more often than not, especially when the truth is too boring or too sad to satisfy. What was true was that Silas's death put the final nail in Whiskey Creek's coffin. If there'd been any doubt that the place was cursed, any thought of maybe trying to revive it as a mining camp, that doubt died with the young man from Kentucky. Nobody wanted to work claims in a canyon where men died from drinking phantom whiskey. Nobody wanted to build a town where ghosts outnumbered the living. The few people who'd been hanging on a prospector here, a drifter there, they pulled up stakes and left. By the end of 1893, Whiskey Creek was completely abandoned. Even the birds stopped flying over it. Even the coyotes quit howling in that canyon. It became a place of whispers and warnings. Mothers told their children about Whiskey Creek when they wanted to scare them into good behavior. You keep lying and you'll end up like the miners at Whiskey Creek, poisoned by your own greed. Prospectors would mention it when warning newcomers about the dangers of gold fever. Don't get too hungry for riches, boy. Remember Whiskey Creek. The barrel itself took on mythical properties in the stories. Some said it was made from the wood of a gallows where 13 men had been hanged. Others claimed it had been stolen from a church, that it had held communion wine before being repurposed for whiskey, and the sacrilege had cursed it. A few insisted it was older than America itself, brought over from Scotland by a witch who'd used it to brew poisons before being burned at the stake. None of these stories were true either. It was just a barrel, or had been once. Just wood and iron, built by some cooper in Kentucky who never imagined his handiwork would outlive him by half a century and become the stuff of nightmares. But something had happened to it, something in the years it sat in Sadie's saloon, absorbing the greed and suspicion and hatred of 4 men who drunk from it every Saturday night. Something in the moment when one of them or someone had poured poison into its depths. Something in the 20 years it had sat in the ruins, holding whiskey that shouldn't exist, waiting for the next victim. The barrel had become something more than just a barrel, had become a repository for all the darkness that gold brings out in men, had become, in its way, the physical manifestation of Whiskey Creek's curse. Travelers who passed through the area, and fewer did with each passing year, reported strange things. They'd hear voices in the canyon, 4 men arguing about shares and ownership and who'd betrayed who. They'd see lights in the ruins at night, like someone had lit lamps in buildings that no longer had walls to hold them. They'd wake up from dreams about whiskey and gold and poison, dreams so vivid they'd swear they were memories from someone else's life. And the coyotes stopped howling near Whiskey Creek entirely. Dogs being brought through would whine and pull at their leashes, refusing to go closer. Horses would balk and have to be blindfolded and led. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place when it could, rushing past rather than through, like it didn't want to carry away whatever lingered there. A professor from back east came through in 1895, interested in mining camp folklore. He'd heard the stories about Whiskey Creek and wanted to document them for a book he was writing about the psychology of gold rushes. He spent 3 days camping in the ruins, taking photographs and notes, interviewing anyone who'd been there or knew someone who had. On his last night, he wrote in his journal, "There is something genuinely unsettling about this place. I am not a superstitious man. I believe in science and reason, but I cannot shake the feeling of being watched here, of being unwelcome. The locals warned me not to drink from the barrel, which still sits where it was found next to young Morrison's death site. I have no intention of drinking from it, but I will photograph it before I leave, for documentation purposes." His body was found a week later by a mail rider. Same position as Silas on his back, arms outstretched, that terrible look of understanding frozen on his face. His lips were stained dark, his camera was smashed, the glass plates destroyed, like something had deliberately prevented his photographs from ever being seen. The barrel sat next to him, still half full, still waiting. After that, the authorities, such as they were in that part of the territory, decided something had to be done. A deputy rode out with 2 men, intending to destroy the barrel once and for all. Burn it, smash it, bury it deep enough that nobody would ever find it again. They tried to lift it, to carry it somewhere more convenient for destruction, but found it impossibly heavy. 3 men couldn't budge it, though it was just a barrel half full of liquid. They tried to drain it, but the spigot wouldn't turn, and when they attempted to pry off the lid, it was like it had been sealed with iron rather than wood. Finally, in frustration, one of them drew his pistol and shot the barrel. 6 times, point-blank range, bullets that should have shattered the old wood and spilled the whiskey into the sand. But when the gun smoke cleared, the barrel was untouched. No bullet holes, no damage at all, just that same weathered wood and sweating surface, like it was laughing at them. They left it where it was. Rode back to town and filed a report that said the barrel had been destroyed, problem solved. Nobody believed them, but nobody wanted to ride out there and check either. Easier to just avoid Whiskey Creek entirely, to let the desert reclaim it, to forget it had ever existed. The years passed. The 20th century arrived. The West became less wild, more civilized. Mining camps gave way to proper towns with laws and churches and schools. The old stories started to fade, seemed quaint and superstitious in a new age of automobiles and electricity and reason. But Whiskey Creek remained. The ruins crumbled further, but the barrel stayed intact. The canyon stayed empty, but the voices kept arguing when the wind blew right. And every few years, someone would wander in a treasure hunter, a curiosity seeker, someone who'd heard the old stories and figured they were smart enough or lucky enough to succeed where others had failed. Most of them made it out. Most of them took one look at the dead canyon and the barrel sitting in the ruins and decided their luck was fine where it was, thanks anyway. But a few, a very few, couldn't resist, would drink from the barrel despite all the warnings, despite the bodies buried nearby, despite every rational reason to stay away, and those few would die, always die. Sometimes fast, like Silas and the professor, sometimes slow, making it out of the canyon but succumbing to the poison days or weeks later, but always die, and always with that same expression frozen on their faces, that look of terrible understanding, that moment of clarity when they realized the truth. There was no gold, had never been gold, not really, just greed disguised as treasure, poison disguised as whiskey, death disguised as opportunity. The barrel knew that. The barrel had always known, and it waited, patient as stone, for the next fool who needed to learn the lesson. The ghosts of Whiskey Creek, that's what people called them. 5 men, Jed, Colton, Briggs, Tate, and Silas, who died for gold and stayed for the company, who walked the ruins on moonless nights, replaying their final arguments, passing cups that didn't exist between them, who waited for the barrel to claim its next victim so they'd have someone new to warn, someone new to mourn. The coyotes knew better than to howl there. The birds knew better than to land. Even the snakes avoided those particular ruins, because death had soaked so deep into that ground that the land itself had turned poisonous, had become an open grave waiting for anyone foolish enough to step into it. The barrel waited with them, sweating in the desert heat, humming with the wind, holding whiskey that defied time and reason, waited for the next chapter in its long, dark story. Waited to prove that some lessons can only be learned through dying, and even then, not everyone learns them. Whiskey Creek, the creek that forgot to sleep, the canyon that remembers too much, the place where greed goes to die and never quite manages to stay dead. The ghosts know, the barrel knows, the wind knows, and now you know too, partner. So when you hear about old mining camps with treasures waiting to be found, when someone tells you about cursed gold and phantom whiskey, when the stories sound too good to be true and too terrible to be fiction, remember Whiskey Creek. Remember that some places collect death, some stories repeat forever, and some barrels hold more than just whiskey. They hold the weight of all the sins ever committed in their presence, all the greed that ever poisoned a partnership, all the betrayal that ever ended in blood. The aftermath of Whiskey Creek wasn't an ending. It was a continuation, a long, slow haunting that continues to this day. waiting for the next fool who can't resist the call of gold and whiskey and easy fortune. The ghosts wait too, patient as the barrel they died for, ready to add one more voice to their chorus, ready to prove that some lessons are eternal and some prices are always too high to pay. By the time the 20th century hit its stride, Whiskey Creek had transformed from a dead mining camp into something more powerful and more dangerous, a legend. The facts had long since been buried under layers of exaggeration and embellishment, each storyteller adding their own details, each generation making the tale more fantastic than the last. The dime novelists got hold of it first, naturally, those Eastern writers who'd never been west of Pennsylvania, but who churned out Western adventure stories by the dozens for readers who couldn't get enough of cowboys and outlaws and gold strikes. They took the bare bones of Whiskey Creek four miners, poison, greed, death, and built entire novels around it. The Gold Whiskey Curse hit newsstands in 1897, written by a man named Cornelius Blackwood, who'd never been within 1,000 miles of the territories, but who had a gift for making things up. In his version, the four miners were actually brothers who'd sworn a blood oath to share their fortune equally. When one of them tried to cheat the others, an old Indian medicine man cursed their whiskey barrel, turning it into a vessel of vengeance that poisoned anyone who drank from it with greed in their hearts. It was nonsense, of course, but it sold like hotcakes, went through 3 printings, and established several facts about Whiskey Creek that people still believe today, even though they're completely fabricated. Another novelist, this one calling himself Dakota Dan, wrote The Phantom of Whiskey Gulch in 1901. His version had the four miners being railroad men who'd stolen gold from a train shipment and hidden it in a canyon. They'd used a whiskey barrel as a hiding place, packed the gold inside and sealed it up, but they'd chosen a barrel that had been used to transport corpses during a cholera outbreak. The sickness still clung to the wood, and it infected the gold, poisoned the whiskey, cursed anyone who touched it. Also nonsense. But it added the element of disease to the legend, which some people found more believable than straight-up poison. It also explained, in Dakota Dan's logic, why the barrel never rotted and why the whiskey inside never evaporated, because it wasn't really whiskey at all, just the liquid remnants of decomposed bodies that looked like whiskey but carried death in every drop. Disgusting, certainly, but the book sold well enough to warrant a sequel, Return to Whiskey Gulch, where the ghosts of the 4 dead miners had to fight the ghost of a 5th man who drunk from their cursed barrel. It made absolutely no sense, but readers didn't care. They wanted the story, wanted the thrill, wanted to believe that somewhere out west there was a place where greed and death had become so intertwined they were practically the same thing. The traveling shows picked up the story next. Wild West shows were huge business in those days, Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley and all their imitators touring the country, bringing the excitement of the frontier to people who'd never seen a real cowboy or a real Indian. They needed stories to tell between their sharpshooting demonstrations and their stagecoach robberies, and Whiskey Creek fit perfect. The version they told had evolved significantly from the truth. In the show version, the 4 miners were actually famous outlaws, associates of Butch Cassidy or Billy the Kid or whoever was popular that season. They'd stolen a fortune in gold and hidden it in a cursed canyon where an ancient witch had once lived. She'd put a spell on the land that turned any whiskey drunk there into poison, and the 4 outlaws had died laughing, too drunk to realize they were killing themselves, their gold still hidden somewhere in the ruins. After each telling, they'd sell maps. For just $2, you could buy a map that showed exactly where Whiskey Creek was located, where the barrel could be found, where the gold might still be buried. The maps were completely fake, of course, usually just showed someplace vaguely in Arizona or New Mexico, with an X marked Cursed Canyon and some decorative drawings of barrels and skulls. But people bought them by the hundreds, thousands, probably, over the years. And a few of those people actually tried to use the maps, actually went west looking for Whiskey Creek. Most of them never found it. The maps were too vague, the territory too large. A few stumbled across the real place by accident and left quickly, spooked by the desolation and the stories, and a very few drank from the barrel and died just like the legends promised, adding their bodies to the collection and their names to the ghost roll call. The newspapers loved the story too. Whenever they needed filler or whenever circulation was down, they'd run a piece about Whiskey Creek. The Cursed Canyon of the West, or Where Gold and Death Share a Barrel, or some other sensational headline. They'd interview supposed eyewitnesses, men who claimed to have seen the ghosts, women who claimed their husbands had died after visiting the ruins, prospectors who swore they'd found the original gold but couldn't recover it because of the curse. All of it probably lies, exaggerations at best, but it kept the legend alive, kept people interested, kept Whiskey Creek in the public imagination long after most mining camps had been forgotten. The story changed depending on who was telling it and when. During Prohibition, the barrel became a symbol of the dangers of alcohol. See what happens when men drink. It kills them eventually. Better to abstain entirely. After Prohibition ended, the story shifted again. Now the barrel represented illegal moonshine, the kind of rot-gut whiskey that actually could poison you, a warning about unregulated spirits sold by unscrupulous bootleggers. Some versions emphasize the gold, making it the center of the story. In these tellings, the whiskey was almost incidental, just the method of murder the miners used on each other in their fight over the fortune. The curse wasn't on the barrel, but on the gold itself, which would never bring happiness to anyone who found it, would only bring death and betrayal and loss. Other versions made the barrel the star, the gold almost forgotten. These were the spooky campfire tales, the ones told to frighten children or entertain tourists. The barrel that couldn't be destroyed, that always reappeared no matter how many times people tried to bury it or burn it. The barrel that whispered names of the dead on windy nights, the barrel that sweated whiskey in the desert heat, even though there was no logical reason for it to stay wet. A few storytellers tried to make it romantic, doomed miners who were actually friends, who poisoned themselves together rather than fight over gold, who chose death as brothers rather than live as enemies. It was a nice thought, but it didn't match the facts. There was nothing romantic about what had happened at Whiskey Creek. It was just ugly and greedy and sad, the way most gold rush stories are when you strip away the shine. The locals in towns near Whiskey Creek had their own versions, passed down from people who'd actually been there or who knew people who had. These stories were usually simpler, closer to the truth, less embellished with magic and curses and ghosts. But even these versions had picked up details that weren't quite right, dates that didn't match, names that had been misspelled or changed, motivations that had been guessed at rather than known. Old-timers would sit on porches and tell younger folks about the time before the poisoning, when Whiskey Creek was actually a real town with real people. They'd talk about Sadie and her saloon, about the other miners who'd worked claims there, about the winter of '73 when everything went to hell. Some of them claimed to have known the four partners personally, though the math rarely worked out on those claims. Jed was a good man, one old prospector would say. Just got twisted up by gold, same as any of us might. Colton was a cheat from the start, another would counter. Knew him in Deadwood before he came to Whiskey Creek. He'd steal the pennies off a dead man's eyes and call it salvage. They'd argue about details, what year it happened, how much gold there really was, who poisoned the barrel if anyone did. But they all agreed on the essential truth. 4 men had died over greed, and their deaths had cursed a place that might have become something more if they'd just been able to share what they'd found. The supernatural elements, the ghosts, the indestructible barrel, the whiskey that never evaporated, those were harder for the locals to discuss. Some dismissed them entirely as nonsense added by Eastern writers who didn't know any better. Others swore they were real, that they'd seen or heard things in that canyon that couldn't be explained by natural causes. I heard them voices, one old woman claimed. 4 men arguing clear as day, only there wasn't nobody there, just the wind and the ruins and that damn barrel sitting in the sand. You heard what you expected to hear, her son would say. Place has a reputation, and our minds play tricks on us when we're scared. I know what I heard, and maybe she did. Maybe the ghosts were real, and the barrel really was cursed, and all the supernatural elements were actual truth rather than legend. Or maybe more likely the story had become so powerful, so deeply embedded in people's minds, that they started experiencing it as truth, whether it was or not. Started seeing ghosts because they expected to see them. Started hearing voices because the story said voices would be there. That's the thing about legends, partner. Once they get big enough, once enough people believe them, they start taking on a life of their own. The story becomes more real than the reality that spawned it. The legend becomes truth by sheer force of repetition and belief. By the 1,920 seconds, Whiskey Creek was as much a mythical place as a real one. You could find it on maps if you knew where to look, but reaching it was another matter. The roads were bad, the territory was empty, and most people who went looking never found exactly what they were searching for. They'd find a canyon with a dry creek bed. They'd find ruins that might have been a mining camp or might have been something else. They'd find old barrels rusting in the sand. But was it the Whiskey Creek, the one from the stories? They could never be entirely sure, and maybe that was fitting. Maybe Whiskey Creek was meant to be more legend than place, more warning than destination. Maybe it served its purpose better as a story told around campfires than as coordinates on a map. The dime novels kept coming, each one more outlandish than the last. The Barrel of Blood, Whiskey Canyon Redemption, The Ghost's Gold, dozens of variations on the same basic theme. Some made the miners heroes, some made them villains. Some invented entire backstories explaining how they'd become partners and why they'd come to trust each other before that trust shattered. None of them got it quite right. None of them captured the simple, ugly truth that 4 ordinary men had found extraordinary wealth and it had destroyed them from the inside out. That there was no curse except the one they'd put on themselves. That the poison in the barrel, if there was poison in the barrel, was no more toxic than the poison in their hearts. But people didn't want that truth. It was too ordinary, too disappointing. They wanted the curse to be real, wanted the ghost to walk, wanted the barrel to be indestructible. Because if those things were true, if Whiskey Creek was genuinely supernatural, then it was unique, singular, something that could never happen again. But if it was just 4 men and their greed, well, that could happen anywhere, could happen to anyone, and that was a much scarier thought than any ghost or curse could ever be. So the legends grew, feeding on themselves, building layer upon layer of fiction over the small foundation of fact. The curse in the bottle, the gold that couldn't be found, the barrel that couldn't be destroyed, the ghost that walked at midnight, the whiskey that killed anyone who drank it. All of it true. None of it true. Somewhere in between true, the way legends always are, real enough to persist, unreal enough to fascinate, powerful enough that the name Whiskey Creek still meant something decades after the camp itself had turned to dust. The curse in the bottle, that's what it came down to. Not a supernatural curse put there by witches or medicine men, but the curse of human nature, the poison of greed, the death that waits in any partnership built on lies and suspicion, and the inability to share what fortune provides. The bottle held that curse, held it then and holds it still, waiting in the ruins for the next fool who won't learn from other people's mistakes, waiting to prove that legends exist for a reason, and the reason is this. Some truths are too terrible to face straight on, so we wrap them in stories and ghosts and curses, make them safe enough to talk about, make them distant enough to seem like they could never happen to us. But they can happen. They do happen. And Whiskey Creek stands as proof, its barrel waiting in the desert sun, its story growing with each telling, its curse spreading not through magic but through the eternal, unchanging nature of human greed. The legends grew, the truth faded, and somewhere in the middle reality and myth shook hands and agreed to coexist, neither one quite able to exist without the other. The fire's burning low now, partner, the coals glowing red and orange in the darkness, throwing shadows that dance and flicker like they're trying to tell their own stories. The night's gone deep and cold the way nights do out here in the high country, where the stars look close enough to touch and the silence sits heavy as a wool blanket. I've been talking a long time, I know. Old men do that, get started on a story, and can't seem to find the end of it. But maybe that's because stories like this one don't really have endings. They just pause, catch their breath, wait for the next chapter to begin. Whiskey Creek's out there still. About 140 miles southwest of here, tucked into a canyon that most folks have forgotten exists. The ruins are near about gone now, another few decades, and there won't be nothing left but scattered stones and maybe some rusted metal if you know where to dig. The creek bed's still dry, still humming when the wind blows through it just right. Still singing that lonely song it learned from a whiskey barrel and 4 dead men. And the barrel? Well, that's the question everybody asks when I tell this story. Is it still there? Can you still find it? Is the whiskey still in it? Still waiting for some fool to take a drink? I don't rightly know, partner. Last time I was out that way, and that was 5 years back, like I mentioned earlier, I saw something half buried in the sand near what used to be the saloon foundation. Could have been the barrel. Could have been just an old water cask or shipping container. Hard to say. I didn't get close enough to check, and I didn't plan to drink from it regardless. Because here's what I learned in my 73 years walking this earth. Some things are better left alone. Some places don't want visitors. And some stories, even if you don't believe they're true, are worth respecting anyway. The truth about Whiskey Creek, the real truth, not the dime novel version or the campfire tale version, is simpler and sadder than most folks want to hear. 4 men found gold. 4 men couldn't share it. 4 men died because trust is harder to maintain than greed is to feed. That's it. That's the whole story stripped down to its bones. Was there poison in the barrel? Maybe. Maybe one of them put it there, planning to kill the others, but drank from it themselves by mistake or by design. Maybe someone else, another miner, someone with a grudge, poisoned it knowing they'd all drink eventually. Maybe the whiskey just went bad in a way that old whiskey sometimes does, turned toxic from sitting too long in wood that had soaked up too much of the wrong things. Or maybe, and this is what I believe, for what it's worth, maybe there was never any poison in the barrel at all. Maybe they just poisoned each other, slow and steady, with suspicion and accusation and the corrosive effects of greed. Maybe they were already dead inside long before their hearts stopped beating. Maybe the barrel was just whiskey being whiskey, and what killed them was what they'd done to each other over months of partnership gone wrong. But people need their curses and their ghosts. Need to believe that what happened at Whiskey Creek was special, was unique, was something that couldn't happen to them. Because if it was just 4 ordinary men destroyed by ordinary greed, well, that's a mirror nobody wants to look into too close. I've thought about those 4 a lot over the years, wondered what Jed was like before gold got into his blood, whether Colton ever regretted leaving the gambling tables for the harder gamble of prospecting, if Briggs finished his journal before he died, and what those last entries said, whether Tate ever found the home he was looking for, or just found another place to run from. They were real people once, with hopes and dreams and folks who loved them. They weren't villains, weren't monsters, just men who made bad choices, who let their worst natures win out over their better ones, who forgot that some things, trust, friendship, integrity, are worth more than any gold you can pull from the ground. And Silas, poor young Silas, who rode in 20 years too late and died the same death for the same reason. What was he looking for, really? Was it gold? Or was it something else, adventure, purpose, escape from a life back in Kentucky that hadn't worked out the way he'd planned? We'll never know, because he's buried in that canyon alongside the men whose mistakes he repeated without ever understanding them. That's the real curse of Whiskey Creek, partner. Not supernatural, not magical, just the eternal human inability to learn from other people's suffering. We hear the stories, we shake our heads, we say, I'd never be that foolish. and then we go right out and make the same. Mistakes wearing different clothes. Greed don't change, you see. Human nature don't evolve just because time passes and technology improves. We're still the same creatures we were in 1873, still vulnerable to the same temptations, still capable of the same betrayals. The gold might be gone from Whiskey Creek, but the hunger for it, that's as alive now as it ever was. I poured myself a drink before starting this story. You notice that? Whiskey, naturally. Not from any cursed barrel, just regular store-bought bourbon that I paid honest money for. But sitting here telling this tale, watching the fire burn down and the shadows dance, I haven't touched it. Haven't taken a single sip. Maybe that's superstition. Maybe it's respect. Or maybe it's just that when you know a story well enough, when you've told it often enough, it starts to affect how you live. Starts to make you think twice before you drink deep, before you trust too easy, before you let greed guide your choices. The wind's picking up now, coming down from the high peaks where snow stays year-round. It's got a song in it, low and mournful, almost like voices if you listen close enough. Not ghosts. I don't put much stock in ghosts myself. Just wind being wind, finding holes in the rocks and making sounds that our pattern-seeking brains want to interpret as human voices. But whether it's ghosts or just wind, the song's the same. It's singing about choices and consequences, about partnerships built on sand, about treasures that cost more than they're worth, about the price of greed and the weight of betrayal and the long, lonely echo of men who died alone despite being surrounded by partners. Maybe there never was a curse, partner. Maybe the poison was just the truth. Gold don't kill men. Greed does. The metal itself is innocent, inert, just sits there in the rock until someone pulls it out and assigns it value. The killing comes from what we do to each other over it, from how we change when we have it, or want it, or fear losing it. That barrel in Whiskey Creek, real or legendary or somewhere between, it's just a symbol, a marker left behind to remind us of what happened there. Like a tombstone or a memorial or a warning sign. It says, "Here 4 men died for gold they couldn't share. Learn from them, be better than them." Don't let greed poison your partnerships or your souls. Most people don't listen, of course. The treasure hunters still come, still go looking for Whiskey Creek with their metal detectors and their maps and their dreams of easy fortune. A few find the place, fewer still find the barrel. And of those, some drink and some don't, and the ones who drink well, some of them die and some don't, and the stories get more confused with each passing year. But the lesson stays the same, clear as that whiskey I haven't touched. Some reckonings can't be avoided. Some debts come due whether you're ready or not. And some barrels hold more than just liquor. They hold the accumulated weight of all the sins committed in their presence. The fire's just coals now, barely giving off heat. The stars have wheeled overhead like they do, marking time's passage whether we notice or not. Dawn's still hours off, but I can feel it coming the way old bones feel weather changing. This night's about done, and this story with it. So what's the moral here, partner? What am I trying to tell you that you couldn't figure out yourself? Maybe just this. Be careful what you reach for, because you might just grab it. Be careful who you partner with, because you'll become like them or they'll become like you, and either way, somebody's likely to end up disappointed or dead. Be careful what you drink, what you trust, what you believe about easy fortune and buried treasure, and maybe one more thing. The West ain't romantic, wasn't then, isn't now. It's hard and mean and unforgiving, and it reveals what we really are underneath all the civilization we pretend to carry. Whiskey Creek proved that. 4 men came looking for gold and found out they were murderers, or victims, or both. The canyon didn't make them that way. The gold didn't make them that way. They were always that way, just needed the right circumstances to reveal it. That's the real ghost story of Whiskey Creek, not the walking dead or the cursed barrel or the whiskey that kills, but the revelation that when you strip away society and law and all the little rules we follow, when you put men in isolation with more wealth than they can carry and no one to answer to but each other, that's when you find out what they're really made of. And usually, partner, usually it ain't pretty. I'm getting up now, knees creaking like barn doors that need oil. Going to kick dirt over these coals, make sure this fire's good and dead before I head to my bedroll. You should do the same if you've got a fire burning. Can't be too careful in country this dry. Last thing we need is a spark getting loose and burning down half the territory. Of course, some fires can't be put out with dirt. Some fires burn in human hearts, fed by greed and want and the endless hunger for more than we need. Those fires, they just keep burning, generation after generation, consuming men and leaving behind stories that get told around campfires by old fools like me. Whiskey Creek burned that way once. Might burn that way again if the right people find it, if the wrong thirst takes hold. The barrel's still there, I reckon, waiting, patient as stone, inevitable as death, waiting for the next fool who thinks they're special, who thinks the curse won't touch them, who thinks greed is wisdom and taking is finding. But you're smarter than that, ain't you, partner? You heard this story and learned from it. You'll remember when opportunity comes calling with gold in one hand and poison in the other. You'll remember that some prices are too high, some partnerships aren't worth preserving, and some whiskey shouldn't be drunk, no matter how good it smells. Or maybe you won't remember. Maybe you'll hear the song of easy fortune and forget everything I told you. Maybe you'll go looking for Whiskey Creek yourself, convinced you're different, convinced you're better, convinced that what happened to Jed and Colton and Briggs and Tate couldn't possibly happen to you. And maybe you'd be right. Or maybe, come some cold morning years from now, travelers will find you lying in those ruins with that terrible expression frozen on your face, and they'll wonder what you saw in your final moments, what truth revealed itself when the poison took hold, what reckoning you found waiting in the dust, the wind still humming through the canyon rocks, still singing its lonely song, still carrying the echo of glasses clinking that'll never be raised again. Still remembering 4 men who drank together every Saturday and died together on the last Saturday when the whiskey finally told them the truth about themselves. Out here, partner, a man could strike it rich by sundown and be 6 feet under by sunrise. That's the truth of the frontier, where guns spoke louder than gold, where whiskey ran deeper than water, and where reckonings came fast and final to anyone who forgot that we're all just temporary, just passing through, just making choices we hope we won't regret when the accounting comes due. Whiskey Creek remembers, the barrel remembers, the wind remembers, and now you remember too. Use that memory well. Let it guide you when greed whispers and gold glitters and partnerships promise easy fortune. Remember that 4 men died for treasure they couldn't share, died with poison on their lips and betrayal in their hearts, died and became a warning that most folks ignore, but everyone should heed. That's the reckoning waiting in the dust, partner, not just for them 4 miners, but for all of us. The reckoning that comes when we forget what matters, when we value gold over people, when we let greed poison our better nature until there's nothing left worth saving. The fire's out now, the night's deep and still. Somewhere southwest of here, in a canyon most folks have forgotten, ruins crumble a little more with each passing season. A creek bed hums its song, and a barrel waits, patient and terrible, for the next chapter in a story that never quite ends. Sleep well, partner. And if you dream of gold and whiskey and ghosts that walk in ruined mining camps, well, just remember it's only a dream. Whiskey Creek can't hurt you from here, unless of course you go looking for it. Good night now. The wind's still singing, and the stars are cold overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, the past and present are wrapped together like smoke rising from a dying fire. Wrapped so tight you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Wrapped like a warning, like a curse, like a reckoning that's been waiting more than a century for someone to finally understand it. The reckoning in the dust. That's what this story's been about all along. Not gold or whiskey or death, but the accounting we all face eventually when our choices come home to roost, and we have to answer for what we've done and who we've become. Jed and Colton and Briggs and Tate, they faced their reckoning in 1873. Silas faced his in 1893. Others have faced theirs in the years since. And someday, someone will face the next one, because Whiskey Creek ain't done collecting debts yet. But not you, partner. Not tonight. Tonight you just listen to an old man's story and decide whether you believe it, whether you'll remember it when temptation comes, whether you're the type who learns from others' mistakes or the type who has to make them yourself. I hope you're the first type. I truly do. Because Whiskey Creek's still out there, still waiting, still humming its song about greed and death and reckonings that come whether you're ready or not. And that barrel, real or legend, cursed or innocent, that barrel's still waiting too, waiting for the next fool who won't listen, who can't learn, who thinks they're special enough or smart enough or lucky enough to succeed where everyone else failed. Maybe that'll be you someday, or maybe you'll hear this story on some other night, around some other fire, and you'll remember old Earl and his tale about Whiskey Creek, and you'll make the right choice, the smart choice, the choice that keeps you alive and whole and free from reckonings you can't afford to pay. That's my hope, anyway. That's why I tell this story when the fire's burning and the night's listening, not to entertain or frighten, but to warn, to remind, to pass along the lessons learned in blood and dust and whiskey that tasted like death. The embers are cold now. The night's moving toward morning, and this story's reached its end, at least for tonight. Sleep well, partner. Dream safe. And if you ever find yourself in a dry canyon with ruins and a barrel waiting well, just remember what happened to the men who drank from it last. Remember, and walk away. Some thirsts aren't worth quenching, some treasures aren't worth finding, and some reckonings are better left to the ghosts and the wind and the endless, patient dust. Good night now. The story's told. The fire's out. And Whiskey Creek goes on remembering, waiting, humming its song about 4 men in a barrel and the reckoning that never quite settles, never quite finishes, never quite lets go. Out here, partner, the wind carries more than just dust. It carries stories, warnings, ghosts of chances missed and lessons learned too late. Listen close, and you might hear them. Or don't listen, and maybe someday you'll become one of them yourself. The choice, as always, is yours. The creek forgot to sleep, but you don't have to. Close your eyes, partner. The night's still got a few hours left, and tomorrow's coming whether we're ready or not. Tomorrow, with its own choices, its own reckonings, its own chances to be better than the men who died in that canyon for gold they couldn't share. Be better than them, that's all. Just be better. Good night.